All right, yes, we're recording. So welcome everybody to the next iteration of the IITE seminar series. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Laura D., who is at the University of Colorado at Boulder. There's the beautiful picture. Apparently, that's the landscape you can see from where she is, recommended for everyone. Now, in this series, we've heard many different kinds of talks before, including many that were in the category of pure theory. But I guess this is the time when we're going to be interfacing a little bit in a way that we are really excited about and putting the ecological theory for actual useful work. So without further ado, Laura, the floor is yours. As usual, if you're not Laura, please turn off your microphones for the duration of the talk. And without further ado, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the organizers for hosting me. And yeah, this is Colorado. So if anyone is coming through Colorado or wants to come visit, let me know. So this talk and much of my research program is motivated by the fact that humans are a major driver of our ecosystems, and we don't really have natural, pristine ecosystems that are separate from human influence. So if you take a look at this map, the light colors are showing the number of travel days to every place on the planet from a major urban center. And the blue lines are showing transportation routes, highlighting just how connected our planet is through movement of people. So ecological theory, and the ecological theory that I do has an interdisciplinary bent, particularly because I also have training in economics, but I also work with people from all sorts of different disciplines like math, economics, sociology, psychology, and also I have a lot of ongoing relationships with managers. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about more of my theoretical work in this area than my really on the ground work with managers. So in particular, I study how ecosystems contribute to human well-being and how humans affect nature, both through impacting ecosystems and management that also alters and conserves biodiversity. So on one hand, humans impact nature in harmful ways. We're all familiar with human-driven environmental changes like land use change, climate change, invasions, and harvest, all that alter biodiversity and ecosystems and also have consequences for people through altering ecosystem services. But at the same time, humans can also take decisions that can enhance ecosystems through protection, like marine protected areas, restoration, harvest control, or corridors, which actually can change the connectivity of our ecosystems and the movement of species. So my research areas broadly study the consequences of global change for ecological systems and people. And I'm really interested in understanding how the consequences of global change, like climate change, land use change, how the consequences will depend on differences in the responses of different types of species and ecosystems across a landscape. So if you can see this little photo, for instance, you can see that some trees after a big wind event have died, and others are still standing. So this highlights that species traits or differences in responses are going to influence the consequences for things like carbon. The other aspect of my research is thinking about the role of conservation and management decisions, which actually can mediate the effects of these global changes through human decisions in ways that actually will feed back and affect future biodiversity communities. So even if we're not, as theoretical ecologists, interested in conservation per se, I would make the argument that it's important to consider because these decisions actually will feed back and affect biodiversity change in these really sort of endogenous ways. So for instance, if we're thinking about a management decision to enhance pollination services, one decision might be to restore native prairie habitat near an agricultural field. This will then have these spillover effects by changing the pollinator community, maybe enhancing pollinator abundance. That's then going to have feedbacks to enhance future pollination. So these are really decisions that are happening all over the place that are part of the dynamics of ecosystems. So given that backdrop, my motivation for today's talk is to what extent can ecological theory help us understand the consequences of a variety of global changes to inform conservation goals. And I'm going to bite off a very small piece of this question and specifically focus on the goal of conservation that's relatively new, which is ecosystem services, or the contribution of nature to human well-being. And when I talk about ecosystem services, I'm talking about things that have direct market value, like timber or fish for food production, but also these services that depend on ecosystem processes, like pollination for crops, or shoreline protection by coastal habitat that can protect against property damages or damages to human life, all the way to things like cultural services, like a sense of place or recreational value, or the cultural value of iconic species. So I'm going to focus this talk on this question: how can we maintain ecosystem services in the face of global change, and highlight a couple of important challenges that create research gaps that I think are prime for theoretical ecology to begin to address. So the first challenge that creates important research gaps is that global change impacts to ecosystem services beyond things like land use change or slow changes are not well understood. And that's because the focus of most studies on ecosystem services is about mapping services. So identifying where they are in the landscape and at what quantity. And so the way this is often done is by taking a land cover map to say, okay, this is a land cover type of forests or urban, and then associating an average value of an ecosystem service with that land cover. So that really precludes understanding how things like disturbances or policy change or species interactions, things that are happening maybe within a year, how those are affecting services. And then largely in parallel, in ecology, we're gaining a growing body of knowledge about how global changes like carbon dioxide fertilization, drought, ocean acidification, how these changes are impacting species and ecosystems. But a challenge on this side is that most ecological studies don't measure ecosystem services per se. They typically stop at looking at community responses or ecosystem responses. So just to provide a more concrete example of what I mean by that, I love this paper by Ian Donahue and colleagues that was in Ecology Letters, where they looked at the different ways that stability has been used. And they highlight that stability is typically measured in terms of biomass or community composition across different types of studies, but rarely measured for the function or a service or process in itself. So that's a gap, because if we want to extend insights from these types of studies, we're making an assumption that the responses of biomass and communities are going to also map on to changes in things like services and functions. So the more narrow question of this talk is, how well do changes in ecological communities map onto these changes and benefits to people? So if we're making this leap from response variables studied in ecological studies to services, which are the focus of a lot of conservation efforts, how well does that do? Because if these measures that we're typically using are strong predictors of changes in services, then we have this huge body of research that we can draw on to gain new insights into services that are not particularly well leveraged right now. So I'm going to talk about some examples of my work tackling this larger question through two case studies. So thinking about comparing impacts of global change drivers on ecosystems versus services. The first is going to focus on a new framework for tracing the consequences of extreme windstorms in forests. And then the second is the consequences of species losses in coastal food webs. And then I was told by the organizers that I should try to keep the talk short. Hopefully I have, to leave time for some discussion. So I've come up with some discussion prompts for you all to hear about your work. So in the first case study, I'm focused on this challenge that climate change is intensifying our disturbances and making these large disturbance events happen more frequently. So here's an example in my home state where there was a massive large-scale pest outbreak of bark beetle. We've also seen in the news various mega fires from around the world, extreme droughts, and intensifying hurricanes. So what we can say is that climate change is starting to push our disturbances towards seeing a higher frequency of these really intense events. But in reality, we have uncertainty over what particular disturbances will occur and where. So this creates challenges for anticipating the consequences of disturbances for ecosystems and their services. So this project looks at two questions. What are the consequences of shifting disturbance regimes that are highly uncertain for ecosystems and their services? And the second question, in line with this bigger question of the talk, is do measures of ecological community change predict service change? And this is a collaboration with economists Steve Miller and Steve Pulaski, mathematician Kate Helmstead, and ecologists Peter Reich and Kate Boersma. And we've developed a new mathematical framework that we're then applying to these cases of extreme windstorms and their consequences for above ground biomass, timber, and tree communities. And when I'm talking about windstorms, it's not like a little nice wind, warm spring wind. Actually, these windstorms take out huge swaths of the forest, and then it becomes inaccessible. It's highly dangerous. So our contribution that I want to highlight here is that we're really focused on uncertainty over the disturbance regimes. And this contrasts to common approaches that are used in ecology and current ecosystem service studies. So with ecology, many studies will look retrospectively at the consequences of a disturbance or comparing before and after, or applying a particular disturbance level in an experiment, or considering process-based models that use scenarios but are deterministic. So if we thought about it, we can think about the probabilities really as just these kind of points. In contrast, ecosystem service assessments just ignore disturbances right now. And here we're going to model a distribution of potential disturbances, which can lead to a distribution of potential futures. So this is just a high-level sketch of what we do for the mathematical framework, but I'll talk about it in more concrete detail, where we're considering that at the core of the contribution that disturbances are uncertain. So we don't know exactly which intensity is going to happen, and climate change is shifting that distribution. So we consider that environmental disturbances occur, they impact the ecological community, that has consequences for services, and then that could also be translated to benefits to people. So that could be valued in dollars, but it need not be. And really importantly, that actually there are socioeconomic changes and responses that are happening at the same time, like policy change, market change, or people's preferences that are changing. And that's going to potentially lead to differences in a community response versus ultimately how benefits to people are responding to disturbances. And a core part of this framework is considering the role of species traits in predicting responses to environmental change and effects of how species contribute to ecosystem functions and services, and the fact that these are different. So if we come back to this example of the trees after a wind blowdown event, you can see that some died, some didn't, and depending on their contribution to different services, this is going to affect the consequences for various services like carbon, timber, recreation, etc. So since this is a theory group and I'm already a little bit more on the applied side, I threw in an equation, but if anyone's done anything that interfaces with economics, you'll know that this is very basic. But basically we consider the expected value, which is going to be a function of the discounted utility, and utility here is a function of an ecosystem service production function, or as ecologists might call it, the effect function, which depends on the community. So the abundance and traits of the species, other environmental factors, but also importantly, in contrast to a lot of existing ecological frameworks that use species traits, we explicitly incorporate socioeconomic factors. So for instance, if we're thinking about things like timber production, just as a really concrete example, there's particular management rules where you don't harvest species below a certain size, right? So the way that the management system interacts with the species community, it really determines which traits contribute to services. So it's important. And then we also consider that the community is modified from a disturbance response function that takes into account the prior community and its traits and abundances and the disturbance intensity. So what we do with this kind of high level framework, again, is to actually apply it to a particular case study where I'm parameterizing it. And this is to trace the consequences of severe windstorms in forests in Minnesota. And I do this for over 770 forest plots throughout northern Minnesota, which is a representative boreal forest, mid-latitude forest. And each community has information on the species that are there, their relative abundances, and also individual level traits, which is really quite cool. So a really important trait for this system is the size of the tree. And to take this framework and really parameterize it, we first have an initial community, and we can determine this response function using empirically estimated relationships between traits and the probability of mortality. So in this case, we have the probability of mortality for a windstorm of a particular intensity for each species, and it depends on the size of the species. So larger trees are more likely to get blown down, not rocket science, but it depends on the species identity as well. So then we can use that with a Monte Carlo simulation to then generate a new community, a new sampled community. We can then translate that with the service production function or effect function using known relationships between the size of the tree and things like biomass, volume, and in this case, we actually use merchantable volume for timber products. And so this is again using empirically estimated relationships between traits and services that existed. And then because the service that we're considering here, just as an example, is timber, I'm then incorporating market data. So we can then determine an expected service value for different types of timber products in the region. And I just want to point out that this is one run of the model for a single community and single intensity, but we're really doing this for a range of intensities for over 770 communities. So here's just kind of a higher level view of the approach, because we're doing this whole process thousands of times using Monte Carlo simulations. So we have our disturbance regime. We pull a disturbance of a particular intensity, apply it, and then that gives us actually a distribution of potential future communities and services, because the impact depends on the intensity of the disturbance. So with this, we can quantify different types of outcomes for ecosystem services. We can look at the expected value or amount. We could actually also look at the variance in the outcomes for services. So not that we need a new metric of stability, but I think we've actually accidentally created one. We could also look at before and after the fraction of the service remaining, which is a new metric that we call functional resistance of the service. And so what we do for this is then compare community changes to ecosystem service changes for each of those measures. And for example, a commonly used metric of community change is the similarity in the community before and after. So we can do that here with our simulations, comparing for each iteration and sample of our simulation, the communities, expected communities before and after. And we also do this for community resistance, but also biomass resistance. So what if we stopped our measurement at biomass, so looking at biomass before and after the disturbance, and didn't translate to services? So how well did those two measures predict the service responses? And then in terms of the simulations that we actually do, we consider a baseline disturbance scenario. So intensities and probabilities that are reflective of the recent past, a climate change scenario where we're considering that more intense disturbances are going to be more likely. And then this one I'm pretty excited about. We also consider what if you allow the human system to respond, right? So we know that if you have disturbances, this can kill trees, which can give us supply shocks or reduce supply in the timber market. And you might have responses like price responses because of the supply demand dynamics, where actually in response to the supply shortfall, prices can increase, right? So we're actually then adding this dynamic human response in one of the scenarios. So the first set of results is answering that first question: what are the impacts to services? What are current approaches to services that ignore disturbances potentially missing? So the key comparison here is that this line of 1 is what current assessments would predict, that if you ignore disturbances, then the fraction of services remaining under a disturbance is just going to be the same. So keep that in mind as I go through these figures, that this is sort of the comparison to the status quo. So under the baseline disturbance regimes, we see that on average, the losses could be around 30% in response to disturbances. And there's a lot of variation across locations. So the key thing here is this is a wedge between what current assessments would predict versus our approach. Under climate change, that wedge or difference between our approach and current assessments, it can be even larger as disturbances intensify. And one thing to point out is you also do see substantial variation across the region. And that's actually driven by these differences in community composition and how species respond to the disturbance, but also differences in their contributions to the service. So the variation that we see across locations is driven by how these two functions sort of match up. Then the next result is comparing the ecosystem service outcomes to community resistance. So community resistance is measured as the similarity in the community before and after the disturbance using commonly used metrics from ecological studies. And then we compare this to the service measure of the fraction of service remaining, which is the analogous measure for services. And there's really quite weak relationships between the two. The relationship, I should note, is even weaker when you start to think about the human responses, so the price responses. But then finally, we think that, okay, well, what about if we look at biomass? Because a lot of the studies look at the resistance of biomass. That should, in theory, for this service, be a good proxy because timber depends so heavily on biomass. So here, this black line is showing the resistance in terms of biomass, so before after changes in biomass. And it's shaped like this because we rank the plots from most to least resistant. And then you can see, depending on the scenario, that the biomass under predicts or over predicts resistance. So in this case, just looking at the service under the climate change scenario, the biomass estimate would overestimate the service resistance. So if we're looking at all these dots, the plots are ordered. So you can think about, okay, well, here is the same plot considering services under this climate change scenario. And then if we think about it with price responses, where actually the human system responds to the disturbance and changes the value, you can see that the biomass dramatically sorry, I think I flipped this, but anyway, underestimates the resistance here. So these are systematic biases in how biomass would predict services, even for this service that is so highly dependent on biomass. So a couple of takeaways from this that can hopefully feed into our broader discussion. Disturbances can have large impacts on services. On average, a 50% loss is what we estimate under the climate change scenario. But these losses would be missed by current approaches to ecosystem service assessments and models. However, commonly used ecological measures also fall short of predicting these impacts. We found really low correlations or systematic biases, and these differences were even stronger when we considered human responses to the disturbance. So in conclusion from this first case study, quantifying ecosystem services, especially as climate change is intensifying our disturbances, requires explicitly accounting for disturbances, but also a greater focus on direct measures of ecosystem services and human well-being. So my take on this is ecological theory can readily help advance this gap by expanding the response variables we consider and better integrating human drivers and dynamic human responses into our existing models. So next, I'm going to focus on a system with more complexity. In that last example, we made some simplifying assumptions to reduce the complexity, but also given the nature of the type of disturbance and service. But in this case, I'm going to consider the question of whether considering species interactions in complex networks change the conclusions from part one. So considering the consequences of species loss from coastal food webs for ecosystem services. And part of the motivation for this work is that most work on ecosystem services focuses on the species that directly provide the service. So flounder supporting fisheries, birds that are contributing to bird watching, but actually species depend on one another in complex ways, meaning that species might indirectly contribute to services through interactions. This also means that when we're thinking about this question of the consequences of global change, this creates challenges for actually anticipating impacts to ecosystems and how they're going to affect services. For example, if ocean acidification was harming this bivalve, there could be these cascading consequences to other species by a reduction or loss in their resources. And this would be missed in studies on ecosystem services that don't consider indirect threats or indirect contributions to services. So the motivation was, are we missing indirect threats or species indirectly critical to services? The answer is probably yes, but more importantly, what can we learn from existing food web theory to leverage insights that could be applied to ecosystem services? So being kind of a slow researcher, I started addressing these questions in a working group that I led back as a PhD student at ESTIV, thinking about how we can represent these food webs providing services using networks where we have species that are nodes and interactions of feeding links or other types of interactions, and then connecting species to the services that they contribute to, where services could then be additional nodes in those networks. And by doing this, we can start to explore the consequences of species loss for ecosystem services and food webs using these relatively simple representations of the network all the way to more complicated ones. But here we're focused on simple representations, given that we rarely have really detailed information about food webs and food web dynamics in these systems in need of management. But anyway, this could lead to a couple of different scenarios. The first is that we could have large consequences of species loss for the food web, but little impact on the service if species that are providing the services are not ones that are affected by direct or indirect extinction. The second case that we might think about in this context is that there could be large consequences of species loss for services, but not for food web persistence, because we might have a scenario where the species that directly provide a service are disproportionately threatened compared to other species that might have a stabilizing role in food web persistence. So we might think about particular fish that are over-harvested, or things like whales for whale watching, where threatened species are providing services. And then finally, we might have scenarios where there could be large consequences of species loss for the food web, but also for the services. And taking a network approach, we can begin to understand the indirect effects of species losses for services and how they might be decoupled or similar to the effects on food webs. One potential way of studying this is considering robustness, using common tools from food web theory and network science, where robustness measures the tolerance of food webs to species losses. And in our work, we extended robustness measures to consider the tolerance of services to species losses. So related to this bigger question of the talk, the question of this work that I'll present now is, how related are food web robustness and ecosystem service robustness? Or said another way, can we bring insights from food web ecology to bear on ecosystem services to enhance the complexity of our assessments that are considered in ecosystem service analyses? And this is work led by my PhD student, Aislinn Keys. And this is her Twitter. So to address this question, we added 7 ecosystem services as nodes in coastal food webs, which includes water filtration, wave attenuation, waterfowl hunting, fisheries, bird watching, carbon sequestration, and shoreline stabilization, which then formed a network with nodes that are services in purple and nodes that are species in yellow, and different interactions where you have species interactions, and then these darker links showing which species provide services. And doing this quickly revealed that most species play some indirect role in ecosystem services. So with this data, we then calculate robustness for food webs versus for services, where we simulate different patterns of species losses based on threats that are known to these species in the system. So for example, we would look at the direct loss of certain species in a particular order, and then track the consequences for other species in the system, and also for the services in the system, where you would lose another, like a secondary extinction when a species lost all of its resources, or service lost all of its species that provide it. And for the services, we did this as binary links, but also as weighted links, where we could allow for the service to depend on species proportionate to the species biomass. And we looked at system-specific threats, as well as commonly used orders of species extinctions in robustness studies. For instance, we looked at responses of threatened species, rare species, to pollution, etc. So ultimately, we wanted to compare the response of the food web, or the robustness of the food web, to species loss, and the robustness of the service. And this is scaled between 0 and 1. We did this for 3 salt marsh systems and these 12 sequences of species loss. And what we found was that the responses, of course, varied dependent on which scenario of species loss, but that the responses between the service and the food web were highly correlated in aggregate. So this result potentially suggests that many of the studies on food web robustness could have important implications for services, or at least make important predictions. Then we looked at how particular services and their robustness varied, because different services are provided by different trophic levels of species and have different amounts of redundancy in how many species provide them. So when we did this, you could see here that there's quite a lot of variation across the services in terms of their robustness and in terms of the scenario. And we found that the trophic level of the service, so the mean trophic level of species providing it, in line with past studies, as well as the redundancy of the service, were strong predictors of their variation and robustness across services. So I think that thinking about next steps for this work, in addition to the ones that I will show, thinking about systematic differences in the responses of different types of services to species loss is important. It's also important when thinking about connections to conservation, because different groups of species might be managing for or benefiting from these different services. So that could potentially create opportunities for win-wins for conservation or trade-offs. So in my ongoing work, we did these models, and a lot of this work is focused on models, but not a lot of the robustness studies are actually then validated with experiments. So in an ongoing project, we launched an experiment this summer to actually simulate and test the predictions from robustness analyses for food webs and ecosystem functions with Ali Barner at Colby College. So stay tuned. And then the other part of this that I mentioned is thinking about not only responses of services, but also how this relates to people. So there's a whole set of people in more of the social sciences that are using social ecological networks, where I'm thinking about the people that are using or benefiting from the species, and then also their interactions, like collaboration, that could affect the management, governance, and responses of these systems, which could also induce feedbacks. So this is ongoing. So to summarize, I showed you two examples about whether ecological communities changes predict changes in services. And I found no for the first and yes for the second. So that might be highly not unsatisfying, but hopefully will prompt some interesting discussion questions that I will pose to you shortly. I also just wanted to mention, since I motivated this talk about making ecological theory useful for conservation, that I also have some modeling work that is really closely co-produced with groups of managers. So we're using ecological models in a grassland system with the Nature Conservancy, Department of Natural Resources, and US Fish and Wildlife to do adaptive management of prairies under climate change. So linking ecological models with decision models, and also started a new collaboration where we're looking at ecosystem services and biodiversity in an urban setting with the city of Boulder and helping them with their landscape planning for climate adaptation for multiple objectives. So if you're interested in hearing more about that process, I'm happy to talk about it. And I didn't talk about other various strands of my work that I'm excited about, like causal inference. But anyway, feel free to reach out. Then finally, I'll just end on some discussion prompts and questions for you all. The first is, what are some examples in your work incorporating human drivers, decisions, or dynamics alongside ecological ones? The next question, and maybe this is a little too selfish of a question, is what ecological metrics should this work consider and compare to next? Then what branches of ecological theory are most informative for conservation, where and how? And then finally, practically, in which case can we ignore the complexity that the socioeconomic side adds to our models and have it still be informative? And with that, I just wanted to thank everyone. Please reach out if you're interested in collaborating or applying for a postdoc to work with our group at Colorado.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now, while Laura is preparing to deposit her $100 fine, which comes for proposing yet another stability metrics, I hope you know that was the law.
But I cut it out of the paper.
Okay, $50. Anyway, while she's doing that, if you have any questions, please raise your hand in the participant list and I will call on you. Yes, Matthew, please go ahead.
So I get the impression that most of ecosystem function and services is based on abundances, and yet there's lots of work on individual growth and stuff that communities do that depends on rates of change rather than just abundances. Have I missed a lot of work on this in service and function, or is there a lot more waiting to be done there?
Well, the studies that are really linking to like landscape level services are actually largely based on land cover as a proxy. So they don't even take into account things like individual species or abundance. That's totally ignored from these big models that are used in landscape planning. In terms of work on functioning, I think that some of that was actually a motivation for the first paper that I proposed. Like, what if we stopped at abundance? What if we stopped at growth rates? Like, does that translate to services? And that's, I think, an open question, like under what conditions it does or doesn't. For things like fisheries, for example, of course, individual growth, population dynamics, calling that ecosystem services is just a relabeling of hundreds of years of work. But for other systems and other types of services, like if we're thinking about water quality or pollination, I think those are still really active research areas.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Just raise your hand and ask away. Yes, Axel, please go ahead.
I hope this works. I have a, for your last prompt, I have something. So I think that there's a danger in looking at ecosystem services for conservation. The reason is that the things we are very much worried about are those that take a very long time to recover from disturbances, from destruction. Species that take millions of years, or forests that take hundreds of years. And in the time that these things take to recover, the preferences of society may be very different 100 to 500 years from now. And so we shouldn't pay too much attention to the current preferences. They may not be relevant in many hundred years from now. So I think we can, in this sense, ignore them and say, let's only look at the how can we have a system that can recover well after we have impacted it. And there is also, of course, the need to look at current ecosystem services, but I think as the forest managers and the fisheries managers are doing this well, and we don't have to worry too much about it. What do you think?
No, I think that's an interesting point. I think that, yeah, so like that would be switching the management objective to creating robust systems.
Yes.
Is to maximize some particular function or service at a particular time point. And I think both are valuable, and I think people are thinking about both. It's just hard when the planning horizons for a lot of these decisions are maybe like 10 years is a really long time for this adaptive management project that I've been involved in, right? So the planning periods, the funding for projects is misaligned with that longer term goal in practice.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure, I think, to always be that we should look at services, but we should also, I think, a bit resist to it. But thank you.
Thank you so much. Mike, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk, Laura. I noticed an interesting kind of pattern in your robustness estimates across the weighted and unweighted networks, where you tended to, well, in some of the ecosystem services, for example, carbon sequestration, you saw a big difference between weighted and unweighted networks in terms of robustness, and in other services there was a much smaller difference. Can you kind of dig in? Did you dig into that? Can you tell us maybe why you get big differences in some cases and smaller differences in other cases, and why that might help us focus on some scenarios that are easier to make predictions in?
Yeah, so here's the full suite of results. I think that with the carbon sequestration, that's really driven by the fact that so many more of the species provide carbon, and it's so weighted by biomass in what we did. Whereas like if you think about something like waterfowl hunting, very few of the species provide that. And so I think that it has something to do with the redundancy there. But I think that that would be a really interesting thing to look into, because this, again, is just something that we did for, with the exception of bird watching, we just considered like that the service then in the weighted case was proportionate to the biomass or abundance. But in the bird watching case, we actually considered the fact that bird watching is valued based on rarity. So that one was the inverse relationship. So if that might have been one of the things showing a big difference, just because it was actually a negative function, negative nonlinear function.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions for Laura? Yes, Liz, please go ahead.
Hi. it was really very interesting. You have two very different cases, and in one of them you take into consideration ecological interactions, and the other, you, if I understand well, you just handle the species as isolated ones, and you have the response functions, and that's it. My question is whether you have any method to decide that is it justified to ignore the interactions in a certain situation, whether you check for it.
So in what I've done here, no, but in general, yes. So one really useful approach is called value of information analysis. And I think that could be brought to bear here in a paper led by, that I was involved in by Hui Xiao in Nature Communications in 2009. We looked at the value of information in a network in terms of thinking about if you had functions and they had feedback effects on species survival, and under what conditions or trophic configurations that information would be valuable to get, like before making a management decision, if it would change your predictions and management. So that I think I could drop the link in the chat, or if you actually send me an email after, I'm happy to send that. But I think that that could be a useful tool more broadly to start to rule out scenarios where we do or do not need to have this added complexity. This is my email. I just put it back up.
Thank you. I saw that there was another hand up for a question, but it's no longer there. I don't know if that's because the question is no longer. Oh, there we go. David, yes, please go ahead.
I'm just crashing this, so I didn't want to take time away from anyone else. But thanks, Laura. That was awesome. That was really, yeah, really interesting and very cool stuff. I was just another point on that last prompt that you put up. I wonder whether, and sorry, my internet was a bit dodgy, so I didn't catch all of the last question and answer. I wonder whether part of it depends on what you're trying to conserve, what ecosystem services you're interested in. So for something like the timber example, that's quite a nice, fixed, solid, economically valuable thing. But a lot of what actually motivates people to behave in landscapes and behave in certain ways, it's much more difficult. It's much kind of harder to be captured by some economic models. I think your rarity example in bird watching is a nice example of that. Like, there's no way you can kind of abstract the socioeconomic complexity from the rest of it, because it is the socioeconomic complexity that determines the service, right? So I think there are some sets of things, food production, timber production, stuff like that. Maybe, yeah, you can just ignore it. A whole suite of other things, like people's sense of belonging, like what they want from a landscape, how they're going to manage it, that stuff, it's just like, yeah, I think you're going to have to, yeah, I don't know, suck it up and deal with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was really well said.
Yeah, thanks so much. Are there any other questions?
Or answers.
I had one.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, how widely do you think ecosystem services concepts are appreciated in nonprofits, government agencies in the US? How much buy-in are you finding, or do you have any feeling for that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, a lot of the major conservation organizations have changed their mission statements to explicitly include ecosystem services. So raising it as a priority alongside with species conservation goals. So very much so in all the groups that I work with, it's sort of a mix of what their objectives are. with the city of Boulder, the ecosystem services are really the forefront of their interests, like thinking about the role of habitats and ecosystems and things like flood mitigation, urban heat island reduction, sort of equity and how that's spread on the landscape, with the biodiversity goals being secondary. The other group I work with is a purely conservation focused mission for their adaptive management. So it varies, but again, that's like the Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy has a huge ecosystem service focus now. And I think part of it too is like identifying when you can get both, right? Like acknowledging these are two separate objectives and then finding strategies where you might have benefits for both.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Other questions? Well, while people are thinking, I have some questions. Let's see. So first of all, just this is just a simple clarification, quite kind of question, that at the end of the first part, you were mentioning how using your predictions, which take the climate change effect into account, and therefore the larger spread and the shifted spread of disturbance intensities, that compared to that, traditional estimates undershoot the possible futures, right? Did I understand that correctly? But do I understand also that this is still purely model-based?
Yes, it's pure. Yes. So yes to both of those questions.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Then I guess another sort of technical question about how you were looking at robustness. So were you just doing topological robustness?
Yeah, just topological and then weighted topological. Yeah.
Sorry, what does that mean? Weighted?
What I was talking about in the answer to one of the other questions, where we allowed the contribution of the services to depend on the biomass or abundance of species, but not anything about the food web.
Okay, maybe this is a conversation for a different time, and I'm very happy to discuss it with you, but we were actually thinking of applying these Bayesian network methods to be able to discuss not just what happens if I would remove this species, but what would happen if there's a likelihood of 60% that this species is going to be removed. So for example, if there is some sort of threat network in the background at work, and that influences how things work. So anyway, we can discuss. I would be happy to discuss, in fact.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm aware of some of that.
Okay.
Yeah, let's follow up after this.
Yes,
sure.
and that might be an answer to your what branches of ecological theory are informative. Maybe, you know, knock on wood, maybe this is useful. Yeah, sorry, James, just one more thing, which is it now comes a more philosophical thing, that we're always talking about ecosystem services such as bird watching and whatnot, but these are, to me, they feel like species services. Like an ecosystem service, you would think, is something that the actual system provides, like water purification, which is not provided by a single species, but by the interaction of all those species. And I'm wondering if we need to, and I'm as guilty as anyone else for treating these ecosystem services, which are really just attached to single species. But have you thought about this kind of problem and how to give the system, how to put the system back in ecosystem service?
Yeah, totally. It's a huge challenge because it's not like we can actually isolate the contributions of particular species. Even in these experiments that manipulate biodiversity and measure function, like it's still a function of the environmental conditions, the community. And so I agree, it makes it a huge challenge. This is a challenge that I've been facing, trying to link food webs with services to people, right? Because you have the scales of ecological interactions, then some aggregate service is produced from that. And then it's a total mismatch in the scale of what, that people are actually benefiting or managing. So I see that as a huge challenge. What we did was just assign the services based on known contributions of species to those services. It's a lot easier for something where you have individuals that you can track, like birds or fish. It's a lot harder for things where it's really like the whole interacting plant community that's providing something like water filtration, where you actually might have negative interactions through competition where the species that actually do the most are harmed by other species. So I'm really interested in all of those questions, like if we can tease those things apart, if we should, do we need to? So we should definitely follow up about that. I'd love to talk more about it.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. Okay, I'll shut up, and James, it's your turn.
Hi, so thanks for the super interesting talk. So I just wanted to ask, in both projects you were looking at whether certain metrics predict the loss of ecosystem services. So in the first case, like change in composition, does this predict change in ecosystem service delivery? And I guess I was wondering, because those data sets that you used, or even though they were kind of simulated, those type of data sets, really detailed species level abundance measures, are quite difficult to come by in a lot of cases, and often we will have to rely on much coarser proxies. So do you have a sense of what types of variables do actually predict changes in ecosystem services, or are you doing any work on this?
Yeah, so that's what I'm starting to work on now. Yeah, I should say that. So like this is like a super rich case study where we have individual level trait information. We actually have functions for different intensities, where in reality, I think most systems, you might have a single function that's like an average value per species. So we're looking at that. I also am looking at other measures of the community a priori, to try to understand if certain metrics might be more informative than others. So I don't have an answer for that, but you're spot on. That's where we're going next. So happy to chat more about that, because I owe you an email anyway. So yeah, I'd love to talk about it. But I just wanted to say too that the flexibility here is like, this stuff is the data. This is the simulated data outcome, but actually you could parameterize this with models, expert opinion, like I think this is the function, do it and think about uncertainty. So it's really super flexible. You might swap in different functions here just based on what you think's happening, based on lower levels of information. So we're seeing that now, like trying some of that now.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Well, apparently there are no more questions. So thank you so much again, Laura, for coming.
Thank you so much. Yeah, looking forward. So, and if anyone wants to follow up, this is my contact, and yeah, definitely looking forward to talking with some of you more. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for coming. Next show is in 2 weeks' time. And as usual, we hope to see you all there. So thank you, bye, and have an excellent rest of your day/evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Bye, everyone.